Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, whether it's Ammar Shukri, whether it's, these others as well. There is something as a father that is wonderful about the idea that my youngsters idolize, or idolize is the wrong word, but rather respect an imam to an extent. They want to be near the imam. The imam is not Ronaldo, not Messi, not, I don't know, Tom Brady, not, for example.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a really thought-provoking discussion. It's about the situation in Gaza, of course, but also its ripples across the wider Muslim world.
That's right. And our main source here is a recent conversation with Sami Hamdi, the journalist and activist. We've got these excerpts from a YouTube transcript. Pretty rich stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And our mission today isn't just to summarize. We want to dig in, pull out the key insights, maybe understand the complexities a bit better, and, highlight some of the surprising things he brought up. All for you, our listeners.
Okay, so one of the first things that really jumps out is these unexpected reactions to Gaza, specifically from some non-Muslim communities.
Oh, yeah, that anecdote about the voters in San Diego, lifelong Democrats.
Exactly. White Americans, not Muslim, he specifies. And they're seeing these images, these videos of children being killed, and it's apparently hitting them so hard they're rethinking who they'll vote for after years, decades maybe.
It's a huge departure, isn't it? They actually said they'd prioritize fighting what they see as genocide over, their concerns about potential fascism.
Right.
That's a massive statement.
It really is. And what's also striking is they admitted they didn't know that much about the situation before seeing these.
Shuhada of Gaza want us to know that they're okay, but also that we need to keep going. Because firstly, while they're no longer with us, they're with their Lord. Remember when Asya alayhi salam was being tortured until she was martyred? And she asked, رَبِّ ابْنِ لِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. My Lord, build for me with you a house in paradise. Notice before the house, before the reward, she first asked to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now she is with Him. And Allah says, وَالشُّهَدَاءُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. The martyrs are with their Lord. Asya is with her Lord. And so are all the other martyrs of all time.
It just shows the raw power of that visual evidence, doesn't it? Cutting through political lines.
Absolutely. It forces these really fundamental ethical questions.
And it's not just them. He also tells the story about an African-American pastor.
Right, based on his Christian values.
Yeah, saying he also wants to, quote, punish Joe Biden because of Gaza. So it suggests this isn't just one isolated group feeling this moral imperative to act politically.
Which makes the contrast he draws even more interesting. He observed that within his circles, anyway, the Muslim community seemed more undecided on a unified political response.
It's a really interesting point why that difference in sort of decisiveness, or apparent decisiveness anyway.
So the bigger picture here is this surprising, maybe even challenging level of moral clarity and action coming from some outside the Muslim community.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some assumptions, makes you think about the different motivations at play.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. There was this other really intriguing observation he made about the status of imams in America.
Ah, yes, this was fascinating. He really seemed impressed, almost admiring, of how some American Muslim communities value their imams.
He compared it to the UK, right? The status of imams in America.
Ah, yes, this was fascinating. He really seemed impressed, almost admiring, of how some American Muslim communities value their imams.
Compared to the UK, right? Saying it's different there, that imams maybe aren't seen as such prominent role models, especially for young people.
Exactly. That's the contrast he drew. And he shared that personal story about his son.
Oh, wanting to be like Omar from the Jenna series.
Yeah, the idea that a kid would look up to an imam like they might I don't know, a pop star or something. It really paints a picture of different cultural values.
So why the difference? Did he have a theory?
He did. He talked about incentivization, the idea that in some U.S. communities, they actively support talented individuals to go study, get deep Islamic knowledge, often overseas, and then come back specifically to serve and lead.
So it's a deliberate cultivation of leadership.
Kind of, yeah. Proactive support to create these knowledgeable, respected figures, which he contrasted with his generalization about some other places where maybe the main qualification is just Quran memorization.
Which is vital, of course, but maybe doesn't automatically translate to that same level of community leadership or connection he saw in the U.S.
Right. So it points to this interesting cultural difference in how religious leaders are perceived, valued, and maybe even developed.
Okay, moving on. The discussion really dives deep into Saudi Arabia's role, which he frames as, incredibly complex and central for Muslims watching the Gaza situation.
Yeah, and he tackles this idea of Saudi Arabia's language, its rhetoric, seeming to change regarding Israel.
But he doesn't think it's a real policy shift.
Not necessarily. He argues it's more about managing public opinion. Fear of backlash over Palestine. He stresses that bin Salman is very aware of how deeply his own population feels about this issue.
That makes sense. It's always been a tension, right? The state's alliances versus popular sentiment.
Absolutely. So bin Salman's walking this tightrope, which might explain the reports Hamdi mentions about restrictions during Umrah or in the Haram.
Like people being stopped for having free Palestine merchandise.
Exactly. Or that story about the Turkish man arrested. It suggests an effort to control the narrative, prevent public displays that challenge the official line.
And what about the dua made by Sheikh Sudais? He linked it to the Crown Prince's vision.
Yeah, Hamdi interpreted that as maybe an attempt to sort of co-opt the issue, fold it into the state's agenda to manage that public feeling. It's all very layered.
Layered, and maybe contradictory. He mentioned differences in how pilgrims are treated depending on their passport, and the contrast between state media blaming Hamas and then duas against Zionists still happening in the Haram.
Right. It points to these internal complexities. Hamdi's core argument seems to be MBS is trying to juggle. Give some nods to the pro-Palestine feelings, keep the population relatively calm, but also signal to the U.S. and Israel that, fundamentally, normalization is still the goal.
And who are bin Salman's strongest supporters, according to Hamdi?
Interestingly, he suggests it's often Muslims urging against fitna, internal strife or discord, rather than maybe liberal critics focused on human rights. That tells you something about the priorities within Saudi society itself.
Yeah, definitely. And that comment from the Saudi aide about a future Saudi Arabia no longer connected to any Muslim issue. That's quite a statement about the potential direction.
It's a huge claim, yeah. And Hamdi sets out these 3 conditions he thinks would signal a real policy change towards Israel. Bahrain pulling out of normalization, Saudi closing its airspace to Israel, and stopping Zionists visiting Medina, as he put it.
And none of those have happened.
Nope. Reinforcing his view that the underlying policy hasn't fundamentally shifted.
Then there's Turkey al-Sheikh dismissing calls to cancel concerts for Gaza, citing the bold economic vision.
Right. That really seems to capture the prioritization. And Hamdi believes this approach, this balancing act, is actually working for MBS, domestically at least.
He even mentioned people going for Umrah, asking him not to talk about Saudi issues.
Yeah, suggesting a climate where criticism is discouraged, which he contrasts sharply with the U.S., where he says many masjids host speakers who are openly critical of Saudi policies.
So why focus so much on Saudi Arabia then? What's his rationale?
Because of its unique position. He believes Saudi has the clout, political, economic, religious, to actually exert significant pressure, maybe even force a change in the Gaza situation almost immediately if it chose to use certain levers.
More so than other countries.
Well, he contrasts it with Turkey, for example. He suggests if the U.S. sanctioned Saudi, the government might actually gain domestic support, whereas in Turkey, similar pressure could lead to public unrest. Different political realities on the ground.
Okay, this leads into another major theme. His really strong criticism of Muslim rulers generally. He uses the word betrayal.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back here. He lists examples, the Turkish foreign minister with Marco Rubio, MBS's limited statements, Anwar Ibrahim's dealings with BlackRock and Boeing, Macron's stance. He sees a pattern of inaction or prioritizing other interests.
He even brought up that historical painting, Louis IX, with the flag of Islam under his feet.
Right, as a symbol of what he sees as a long-standing Western ambition or posture. But his main frustration isn't actually with Western hypocrisy. He kind of expects that.
It's with the Muslim rulers.
Exactly. He calls their inaction the spectacular betrayal. He seems genuinely bewildered by it.
And Qatar, how does that fit in?
It's presented as complex, maybe ambiguous. You have Al Jazeera's coverage, but then Netanyahu calling Qatar a very, very good friend. Plus, Qatar's history as an early normalizer. It's murky.
So Hamdi's just baffled that ordinary Muslims aren't putting more pressure on their leaders.
That seems to be a core point of frustration for him. He shares that anecdote about the scholar in Medina stopped from doing dawah in Mecca, highlighting the restrictions.
And he uses the Battle of Badr analogy.
Yes, asking Muslims today to reflect on how they might measure up, what their own shortcomings might be in such a critical moment. It's a challenging comparison.
He really emphasizes speaking truth, doesn't he? Even when it's hard.
Yeah, referencing the Prophet Sirah, He argues the Ummah, the global Muslim community, isn't powerless, but the problem is leaders who are, in his view, almost at war with their own people's sentiments.
Like the story of the Emirati afraid to discuss Palestine.
Right, that fear. And he connects this to the idea that sometimes the fear of a caliphate or instability is used to prop up existing regimes and borders, even if people are unhappy with their actions on issues like Gaza. Okay, then the conversation moves to that really difficult question about Hamas and October 7th.
Yeah, addressing the narrative that questions the timing or asks if it was worth it.
And Hamdi pushes back hard on that. He compares it to asking Syrians if they should have just put up with Assad. His point is that oppressed people often don't have good choices. Oppression leads to breakdowns.
So the question itself is flawed from his perspective, asking Palestinians to just passively accept the situation.
That's his argument. He calls it a concentration camp, strong language, and asks if they should just stay there quietly while facing more oppression and normalization deals happening around them. He uses the analogy of treating a symptom, October 7th, instead of the disease, the occupation.
He mentioned Rama, the Egyptian speaker.
Yeah, on not letting the other side dictate the narrative. Hamdi firmly frames October.
Then Netanyahu will be dragged on his face Yom al-Qiyamah. And all the oppressors, Biden, one by one, they will be dragged. Allah will not hold them to account privately, whisper to the Wali al-Amr privately. No. Allah will bring Hind Rajab and he'll bring Sidra, he'll bring the Palestinians. He'll say to them, oh beautiful souls that were martyred, that still believed in me even when the crisis came in genocide. You didn't say why, oh Allah. You said Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel.
As a symptom of the occupation, not something that happened in a vacuum.
And he adds context about reports that Netanyahu was maybe planning a big West Bank operation anyway.
Right, suggesting maybe it wasn't entirely out of the blue and potentially regional actors were aware or even complicit. It adds another layer to understanding the timing.
What about Dr. Tamimi's idea of normalizing Muslim narratives?
Hamdi brings that up to emphasize the need to constantly focus the conversation back on ending occupation and colonization as the core issue.
But he does directly address those Muslims who are asking, was it worth it, given the terrible destruction in Gaza?
He does. And he draws a parallel to the Algerian War. Controversial tactics were used by the Liberation Front there, too. His point isn't necessarily to justify every action, but to say that the environment of intense, long-term oppression creates the conditions for these kinds of events.
He even quotes Israeli leaders saying they might do the same.
Reportedly, yes, to underscore that desperate situations lead to desperate measures. So, for Hamdi, debating the right or wrong of October 7th in isolation is irrelevant if you don't address the root cause first.
He mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, too.
Yeah, that quote. Nothing justifies apartheid. Driving home the point about the fundamental injustice being the occupation itself.
Okay, the discussion then touches briefly on Syria and the wider region. It's complex.
Very complex. A quick mention of the changes, Ahmed Shah trying to reconcile factions needing funding, all while navigating Turkey's influence, which is itself limited by economic factors.
And dealing with Saudi Arabia, the UAE. It's a tough balancing act for Shah.
Definitely. The Qardawi case in Turkey is mentioned as an example of how geopolitics limits even powerful players sometimes.
And that Gaddafi prediction about an Israel-Turkey border, seeing echoes in Syria deconflict zone talks.
Yeah, Hamdi brought that up. And his view on Erdogan is interesting. Muslim in good times, Turk in bad times. Contrasting Erdogan's focus on Muslim power with MBS's focus on Saudi economic social reform.
Erdogan shifts based on politics. Shah's struggle for sovereignty while needing outside help, and the potential impact of Iran weakening.
Which leads right into the next part, about Iran and the axis of resistance.
Hamdi's take is that this axis is broken, and it wasn't primarily against Israel anyway.
That's his argument. More an axis against the Sunni world, he suggests. And he thinks the weakening of Iranian proxies in Syria actually helped create the opening for Ahmed Shah. Unintended consequences.
What about the Houthis and Saudi's view of Iran now?
He says the Houthis are rattled, maybe facing a new offensive. Saudi is cautious with Iran, watching the U.S. appetite for conflict.
Does he see Iran changing strategy?
Possibly shifting towards negotiating with the U.S., maybe revising its regional plans. He even floats the perhaps unlikely idea of the Lebanese government disarming Hezbollah.
So Iran might want peace now to consolidate.
That's the suggestion, a period to regroup, which in turn might create space for Turkey to expand its influence. It's all interconnected.
So despite all these huge challenges, all this bleakness sometimes, the discussion ends on a note of well, shifting opinion and maybe agency.
Yeah, he emphasizes that public opinion is changing globally on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. He mentions reports of Netanyahu worrying about losing the American public.
And polls showing declining support for Israel in the U.S., among both Democrats and Republicans.
Right. So his core message becomes, look, no one's in total control here. Things can change. Agency still exists within the Muslim world.
He uses the fall of Damascus as an example of sudden, unexpected change.
Exactly. A reminder that things aren't set in stone. And ultimately, he brings it back to faith. Only Allah knows the future and is in control. So maintain optimism in God's justice.